To audience members who have just now joined, welcome to the second day of the September Summit toward an Institute of Black Studies hosted by the Musée du quai Branly in Paris. My name is Edwin Nasr, and I will be moderating today's panel, Blackness and the Aesthetics of Abstraction. Professor Achille Mbembe's inaugural lecture from last night, which invited us to decenter our imaginaries from the dying old world and tune into geographies of resilience, and Professor Mabula Sumahoro's intervention from earlier today, which urged the Francophone sphere to make space for and articulate Blackness, are now archived and accessible to the public via the museum's YouTube channel. I would like to start by acknowledging that we are currently convening under the auspices of a museum in possession of stolen property, the plundered cultural heritage from people oppressed in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere under French colonization. Before I introduce the roundtable and speakers, I would like to inform our viewers that this panel will be conducted in English. Simultaneous translation into French is available by changing the YouTube stream selection. We encourage you to share your comments and questions in the YouTube chat during and after the lecture. We will then share those with our panelists during the discussion. Representation concerns not only practices of depiction or textual production, but practices of delegation and substitution, such that at the point of reception, the Black artist is expected to speak for the Black communities as if she or he were its political representative. This role has fallen on the shoulders of Black artists not so much out of an individual choice, but as a consequence of structures that have historically marginalized their access to the means of cultural production. These words by Kobena Mercer from an issue of Third Text in 1990 continue to preserve their urgency. Mercer has since gone on to posit abstraction as a site of representational critique, wherein expectations of authenticity and ideologies of otherness are toyed with, refigured, and thrown into disarray. Moreover, in a 2016 essay for Art in America, Adrian Edwards has argued that, and I quote, "Blackness in abstraction shifts analysis away from the Black artist as subject and instead emphasizes Blackness as material, method, and mode, insisting on Blackness as a multiplicity. In this sense, we can think of what it does in the world without conflating it with a singular historical narrative or monolithic subjectivity," end quote. We have come to understand the rather strategic genre of abstraction as one rooted in withdrawal, refusal, and contestation. That might also be why African art historians, from Salah Hassan and Shika Okeke Agulu to Okwi Enwezor and René Atter, have continuously privileged practices within the continent that engage with abstraction in order to articulate an African modernity that challenges art history's exclusionary canon, as well as a counter-visuality to colonial regimes of representation. Today, we are joined by Professor Darby English, whose scholarship within art history calls into question deficient institutional framings of Black art and provides a blueprint for more rigorous modes of engagement with African-American visual production. Julie Mehretu, whose paintings, drawings, and prints generate a universal grammar to contest spaces, formations, and excesses of power. Nontobeko Ntombela, whose curatorial endeavors in South Africa and beyond posit exhibition practices and archival research as active tools of resistance and community mobilization. Nolan Oswald Dennis, whose interdisciplinary process and methodology equip us with an ability to visualize a Black consciousness of space. Each one of our speakers will provide their reflection on the historical legacies and contemporary potentialities of abstraction within African and Black diasporic art. Professor Kojo Eshun, whose theoretical musings on radical sonic repertoires and militant visual cultures continue to inspire practitioners the world over, will serve as a respondent to the panel. I will start by introducing Professor Darby English. Dr. English is a Carl Darling Buck Professor of Art History at the University of Chicago, where he has taught since 2003 with a focus on topics in modern and contemporary art and cultural studies. His publications include 6 books. The most recent, To Describe a Life, Notes from the Intersections of Art and Race Terror, published by Yale University Press in 2019, received the 2020 Frank Jewett Mather Award and the 2020 ASAP Book Prize. He is the author of 1971, A Year in the Life of Color, University of Chicago 2016, and How to See a Work of Art in Total Darkness, published by MIT in 2007. From 2014 to 2020, English was adjunct professor in the Department of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art, New York. Darby, the screen is yours.
Pardon me. I was just saying thank you to everyone for the invitation and for being here. I'm so pleased that September has arrived so quickly. Yeah, so Sarah has kindly agreed to advance my slides for me. I won't read them, but I'm happy to return to any of these points or other ones in the discussion. Could we have the first thesis, please? And the next, please. And the next. And the next. And the next. And the next. Next, please. Next, please. Apologies for my typo. And the next. Next, please. Next, please. Next, please. Next, please. Next, please. And the next, please. Okay, thank you, Sarah, and thank everybody for listening.
Thank you, Darby. I'll now be moving over to Julie Mehretu. Julie Mehretu is a world-renowned painter born in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in 1970, who lives and works in New York City and Berlin. She received a Master's of Fine Art with honors from the Rhode Island School of Design in 1997. Mehretu is a recipient of many awards, including the MacArthur Award in 2005 and the US Department of State Medal of Arts Award in 2015. She has shown her work extensively in solo and group exhibitions and is represented in public and private collections around the world. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters and is represented by Marian Goodman Gallery in New York. The mid-career survey show of Julie Mehretu will open at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York this March. Julie, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with my esteemed panelists. I respect all of your work, and it feels wonderful to be sitting at the table, if you will, with you. And I would love to thank both Edwin and Sarah for the invitation and the inclusion. So I'm going to share my screen, and then we'll start. I was born in Ethiopia, as you said, and raised in Michigan in the Midwest of the United States. And early on, when I was in this I lived in Zimbabwe for a few years from 1984, 85, while my father was working there on sabbatical. And I lived and studied in Dakar, Senegal in 1990 and 91 during the first Gulf War. All of those experiences have been enormously influential in terms of my understanding of aesthetics, being, sensibility, every way that I make from. And abstraction was always became this thing that came to me out after college, that became this form of language that I had to insist on and had to kind of negotiate and try to understand why abstraction, why the insistence on abstraction, and what that space allowed for me as an artist. And it became this, it was really clear that it's this vehicle for complexity. It's a vehicle of unknowing, a place for investigation and for interrogation and the invention of a new sense of understanding from within that, a sense of finding myself. And there are various ways through that abstraction, whether it was the logic of map making and making sense of the history of the built environment and the architecture, drawing on the various kinds of histories. And as Akile Mbembe said so beautifully yesterday, this kind of talking about mining some sense of the all-world archive. This became kind of, because of my kind of the many forms that have informed who I am as an individual, all of that was always what I pulled from, and tried to. Representation wasn't a place that by itself I felt like a certain kind of potency that could address the complexities from which I was interested in making from, and also making sense of myself. My known experience was not that could be reduced to a particular nation, a particular experience, a particular sense of identity. And so this not simplistic reality, this way of understanding this kind of complex, contradictory sense of identity and understanding self within the language of painting and within the language of mining, this kind of all-world archive, I could take and cut and remix and paste parts of these together to create this other type of visual experience, this other type of space of trying to make sense of all of this collective kind of making of not just self, but collective self as a part of a bigger context, self as in this state of trying to constantly mine liberation and constantly mine an invention of self that can actually try to create something else, experience something else in the painting as one does in a life. How can that not be reduced to just one or two or three signifiers, which is part of the kind of lineage of modernity and, let's say, colonialism. So this mining of archives for possible thoughts, constructs, world building, this kind of what Mbembe brought up in relation to Glissant, this kind of all-world archive and the kind of possibilities that are emergent in that multitudes of understanding self, of making sense of time, space, place, and multitudes were kind of crucial to the way that I was trying to make sense of my paintings and what was happening within my paintings. That a mark on its own was meaningless. A mark in the context of other marks could take on something, but they were part of this construct of world building and investigation in the paintings, relating to this moment of constant, rapid, vacillating contradictions that we are negotiating. So, I guess there are all these various stages in that, but what became kind of more important to me as I kept working was the kind of, rather than these different elements kind of in relation to one another and constantly being this kind of decentered network of information and of possibilities, there was the emergent as well of the blur of unknowing, uncertainty, precarity, vertiginousness that we're living through, and the failures that are exposed in this democracy that Mbembe talked about, creating this kind of crazy form of anxiety, especially on the part of white supremacy and Eurocentrism. And so within that history too is this kind of the false binary of abstraction and figuration, that it's kind of bound up in this kind of modern colonial understanding of the nation state and of how to destroy earlier forms of world building by kind of taking apart all these potent forms of art making, whether it be visual art, music, religion, architecture, oralities, whatever form of construction, and this way of like colonial or way of to kind of reduce and capture and partition all these different forms of making, also kind of takes abstraction as a vehicle around that, of a strategy for some other possibility in how to negotiate that history when that sense of making from this kind of disenfranchised, broken up rationalistic space, colonial kind of space, is not part of how one creates and makes. The kind of sense of making and being is relies on so many other sensibilities that pull back from the ancestral, from inheritance, from intuited knowledge and knowledge production. And so part of that idea, the abstraction is a way around kind of this way of kind of trying to break apart figuration or representation and other possibilities within that, participate in what are possible in decolonial ways of image making, but also as an artist of place to mind liberation and freedom in terms of what to invent and how to invent from within where one is, at least for myself. So so for me, I think that fundamentally one of the most important parts of what's possible in abstraction for me is that you cannot reduce one of these paintings to a sign or one signifier and then understand the meaning of the entire painting. A friend and I were talking about this yesterday, that the abstraction and what can happen in these paintings can't be reduced to language. This relates to what Darby just brought up in his comments, his notes, and that in that space of that it can't be possible to like reduce it to a single message, reduce it to a particular kind of even spoken language, that it becomes an experiential dynamic, an experiential participatory dynamic that is communitarian, that is engaged with how people subjectively engage with these paintings, that participates in the invention of what is possible in the painting. And in that, a different type of space opens up. There's the liberation as well in the opacity of that space, in terms of what Glissant talks about when he talks about the clamoring for the right to opacity. And there's a difference in the sensibility of the mathematics and the kind of history of where all of that comes from. That alternate logic that can emerge, that refuses the kind of Cartesian logic and narrative and kind of narrative history of the Eurocentric models and what has been kind of the history of modernism in terms of visual art. So when you're thinking about the interpretation of signs and signifiers, when a painting can't be reduced to one or to several, and the gesture by itself is meaningless, but the gesture in the context of other gestures and of the world building that takes place in the painting, that is the potentiality and possibility of a different form of experience. And that's this space of some type of liberatory experience that I'm mining for myself, and the possibility of making and painting here. Many of these paintings, you can tell from the images, relate to and use these photo-based images that I'm showing that's part of this kind of all-world archive, or are responding to previous art historical works that seem important or resonant in relation to certain current events that are taking place, but they're just a part of the bigger history of aesthetics and visualization that I'm coming from. And I think that this form of thinking and making relates a lot to earlier ideas emergent in African abstraction, but and in what is possible in that African abstraction. And what has informed me so much comes from this very different history in terms of trying to unshare my screen. How do I do that?
At the top, right?
Yeah, it's not doing it. There we go. Okay. So in closing, basically, I just want to bring up that colonialism and its effort at divorcing abstraction from figuration, the kind of false binary that existed within what was possible in world making, what is possible, and how abstraction and figuration participate in the construction of a different form of world making, where even art as its own construct is kind of not taken for granted, or not disempowered in the way that it has been through the colonial project, and that abstraction has this space that participates in a very different. It has a different possibility, and in that space is really important for the radical imaginary. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. We're moving on to Nontobeko Ntombela, who is a curator based in Johannesburg, where she works as a lecturer at the Wits School of Art, Wits University. Previously, she worked as a curator at the Johannesburg Art Gallery, the Durban University Art Gallery, and BAT Center. Ntombela's curatorial track includes several exhibitions, the most recent being The Burden of Memory, co-curated with Rose Jeb Courir and Merlin Douala Bell, a multiple-site event in the city of Yaoundé, Cameroon. She has also published extensively, with her recent publication being a co-edited book titled The Yoni Book with Reshma Shiba. Nontobeko is among the co-conceivers of the September Summit. Nontobeko, the screen is yours.
Thank you. I think I probably took literally the 10 minutes that we're giving, so I might be going over time, but I'll try and cover. Can you share the screen, the time? False hierarchies between art and craft, a distinction that has long bedeviled the reception of African art in general, the theoretical and formal distinction often made between areas of practice and the diverse systems of distribution, exhibitions, reception in which material operates can sometimes be misleading and ill serves the artists themselves. Chika Okeke Guru, 1995. When I received this invitation to speak to the historical legacies and contemporary potentialities of abstraction within African art, the first thing that came to mind was the work of Esther Mahlangu. She comes to mind because her work, along with the work of other early modern Black women artists, such as Valerie Desmo, Gladys Mgudlandlu, Nori Mabasa, Helen Sibidi, are part of a research project that myself and curator Nkule Mabasa are currently working on, where we employ aspects of speculative art historical and archive practice and African feminist methodologies in order to interpret their historical contribution into the present day art history. This intervention aims to enrich Black women artists' representation beyond merely being psychosymbolic gestures and towards a critical reading of their intellectual contribution in art history. As Elizabeth Honey and Ruth Phillips have stated, world art history has not yet fully considered the modernism created by people historically deemed as indigenous or native by colonial regimes. Indeed, as Begisiso Peterson reminds us, as we know, colonial apartheid authorities consistently denied the existence of any legacy among Africans worth preserving, an attitude born out of their insistence that Africans had no history. 2002. Within art history today, there is a new focus, or maybe not so new, or what is being termed as ultra-modern, or rather multiple modernisms, which promises to reposition, retell the temporal and spatial narratives of modernity and modernism at large, by situating a focus on the cusp of the visual arts and traditional practice. While these may be great strides towards the Global Art Historical Revision Project, a welcome art historical turn, much of its concern is still mainly premised on the notion of letting in those who are left out, which in turn reproduces yet another form of a Western gaze. And another kind of Western self-redemption project that continues to speak outside of those excluded by the very same regimes. In our project, we want to propose thinking beyond Western redemption. Rather than paying attention to the new naming of modernisms, we are concerned with paying attention to how contemporary moments allow us to see works of artists like Mgudlandlu and her abstraction through a shared progressive space of creativity and a rupture of culture. We premise this on what we see as an intergenerational gesture, what we articulate through African feminist frameworks that we hope would help us refigure or references of such persistent exclusions. In this thinking, we are encouraged by the work of Barbara Boswell in her recently published book titled "And I Wrote My Story Anyway," where she writes, since Black women have been historically and to a different degree are currently denied access to sites of formal theory making, their fiction can be viewed as sites of prodigious theoretical production, as a discursive place where they critique an existing unjust political order and imagine an alternative, more socially just world. 2020. While Boswell is referring to the literary work of South African Black women novelists and how their fiction, in their engagement with the apartheid nationalism, revealed feminist praxis and theory by exploring Black women fiction in this way, Boswell shows us the possibility of how a critical interrogation of fiction can become a subversive site of knowledge. This is similar to how we imagine we can interrogate the work of Black women artists like Mahlangu, thinking of them as protagonists of subversive knowledge. Refusing, yet at the same time accepting to be named, isiNdebele art, traditional wall murals, wall paintings, abstract art, traditional wall design, modern art, or even contemporary art, Mahlangu's work offers a space to interrogate both the past and the contemporary. Through her work, its mediation, Mahlangu questions how abstraction engages with the relative notion of time in an aesthetic process when the object and material move from recognizable and reaches a wholly unrecognizable stage in its diverse motif, colors, composition, and geometric stylization. This thinking about time calls us to think differently about how her work gets made across political, cultural, class, and gender spectrums. It calls on us to question the things not only as the things of the past, but also as the things of now. First shown to the world, if you can change the slide, in 1989 at the exhibition Magiciens de la Terre in Paris, Mahlangu has since navigated the world of culture and fine arts in precarious ways. While celebrated internationally as an artist within the South African visual arts canon, her work has barely countenanced its significance within this abstract art discourse, nor any other artistic genre in a firm, compelling way. As we speak, this artist, who is now 85 years old and has a career spanning over 7 decades, has never had a retrospective in this country. Her work is mostly celebrated within the space of culture and heritage, even though her work continues to be exhibited widely within the space of fine art. Part of this avoidance of reading her work within the abstract art realm has to do with her producing what has largely been stereotyped to be Black art and political art, which was a 1980s art historical phenomenon that lumped all Black artists under this banner, with an expectation that Black artists were producing art that was storytelling and illustrative of rural township scenes and character studies, which are recognizably South African. This, as we know, has been a challenge of understanding the work of artists like David Kulane and Ernest Mancoba, whose work only drew attention in South Africa via his international recognition. Unknown to many, of course, is that Mahlangu's artistic practice speaks to a history of war. From the fight of Mzilikazi rebelling from the Zulus to the White Army Wars in 1883, which for a long time displaced Ndebele communities. At the end of these wars, this community regained possession of land, settling in an area now known as Mpumalanga. The rebuilding of this community came with the practice of wall painting. Wall paintings that were a way to mark visibly their reclaim to land. As such, these markings, while being adopted as traditional practices of women, signal the ending of war, but mostly a political marking of sites. At the same time, as Pesi Mabandu argues, it signaled a modern African expression as they happened in what he calls a thoroughly modern time, even by South African art historiographical thinking. Thinking about her work through this political realm to what is now known as art speaks to her own subjective take on this history. This is hardly a point that gets taken up. Instead, the celebratory and commercialization of culture overtakes what this may mean to her personally. In this stance, she only becomes a representation of a collective and only that. These challenges are both an indication of the politicization of art and the refusal of Black art into the modern and contemporary art discourse. And we argue that these are the ways that have directly challenged ways of knowing. We therefore consider this anxiety that's created by this illusion as a productive space with which to examine how Mahlangu stretches abstraction's modernist connection to traditional concepts, going beyond the wall into the canvas and sometimes into the sculptural. As such, Mahlangu's work performs several suspensions between the folkloric and narrative, to borrow from Chirac again, navigates beyond the binary distinctions such as tradition and modernity, vernacular and academic, urban and non-urban, indigenous and imported. For us, these possibilities of Mahlangu's abstraction, as they begin to show us the possibilities of freedom, artistic freedom, however relative that freedom may be. This relative freedom offers Mahlangu's abstraction and commands us to reckon with Mahlangu's self-articulation, voice and innovation. I'm going to finish just now. It calls us to recognize her positionality as a moment of an epistemic delinking of the troublesome and fixed definitions of craft and fine arts. Urgent in this task is the need to lay out the multiple ways of reading and studying Mkulandu's work. The question as to whether the work is abstraction, representational, or design is therefore not key for us in terms of seeking the definitive descriptions. Rather, what is more important is for us to consider Mkulandu's negation of narrow understandings of South African art canon and the possible disruption of what this offers. And therefore thinking of her voice, agency, and innovation. Most importantly, how a visual abstraction tells us about the possibilities of imagination, the possibilities of imagining one in and out of these confines. Making her work more than just an aesthetic symbol of culture, we engage how Mahlangu challenges the conditions under which Black artists' work is made. Her highly technical paintings, with both conceptually challenging at the same time beautiful to look at, are for us a powerful disruption of the oversimplified gendering of creativity as women's work. Thank you.
Thank you, Nontobeko. We now move over to Nolan Oswald Dennis, an interdisciplinary artist from Johannesburg, South Africa. His work questions the politics of space and time through a system-specific rather than site-specific approach. He is concerned with the hidden structures that condition our social and political imagination. Through a language of diagrams, drawings, and models, he explores the systematic and structural conditions that organize our plural worlds. Born in Lusaka, Zambia, and raised in Midrand, South Africa, he holds a bachelor's degree in architecture from the University of Wits and a master's of science in art, culture, and technology from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. Nolan?
Thank you. And of course, it's an absolute honor and pleasure to be here. I'm just gonna, okay, wait, I should start a timer. My presentation is quite modular, so I'm just gonna see how far I get. Okay. For us, abstraction is a tactical deployment of aesthetic, basically a way to ride the common senses of abstraction, the styles and the conventions to our own destinations, or better, destinations of our own choosing. Put simply, we come to an aesthetic of abstraction with other commitments. We try to take abstraction as a formal category that can be and has been retooled over and over again as a provisional component in a general system of transformation that we call decolonization. Okay, in my opinion, when we introduce Blackness or use the Black consciousness or the Black radical tradition as a lens to think about aesthetics of abstraction, we subject it to a process of transformation through what Chabani Mangani calls a mutuality of knowledge, or basically the multiple underworlds of this colony planet. And at the risk of, maybe sounding a little bit sincere, the secrets of Black love. I guess I'm saying that for me, an aesthetic of abstraction is not primarily the formal markers of minimalist, expressionist, cybernetic, or cosmic abstraction, but rather how those markers are mobilized toward a program of radical change. Something like what Octavia Butler calls or says, everything you touch, you change, everything you change, changes you. So the scheme here is a program to kind of resituate abstraction as a component in this system of changing changes, which we call our secret work. This image is, maybe we can go to the next slide. There's a close-up image of this work by Bokhosi Sekukuni called Gravity. Bokhosi is a close friend, a longtime collaborator, and a kind of spirit guide for me in this work. So I'm going to try think through this sculpture. So the sculpture called Gravity is a model, and it's also a system of coordinates. It's basically like a standard gravity visualization. You can find it in any kind of science museum. The one I'm most familiar with is in downtown Johannesburg at Saibono. And it basically illustrates Einstein's model of gravity as mass distorting the fabric of space-time. This particular sculpture is different only in that the fabric on which this metal ball rests is under too much tension. In the classic model, the tension of the trampoline or the tension of the fabric is lower, so the distortion is exaggerated. And this amplification of the distortion works for the model. That's kind of how it illustrates the principle. In this sculpture, the fabric resists a little bit too much. And when I first saw it, I thought, ooh, something maybe went wrong. But because there's too much resistance, I think this sculpture, which is a model and a set of coordinates, both perfectly enacts the model, kind of Einstein model of gravity, or the illustration of the model. And in a way I can't fully describe, or I can't fully articulate, holds out from that perfect enactment. And I guess, I think my presentation ends here because I don't really want to talk about the rest of the works. Because I think I'm mostly trying to think of abstraction precisely on these terms, the terms that are kind of revealed by the sculpture and maybe caught between these two positions of a kind of perfect enactment and holding out from a perfect enactment. That space in between a model, a system, and a work of art. Yeah, I don't know, should I go on?
It's as you prefer, Nolan.
Can we go to the next slide? I think I have 2 minutes. This this is a list. Actually, maybe we can go to the slide after this.
What is this slide? I'm curious.
This is a list of, I call them chimeric African, I don't really have a good word for them, but they're African states that both exist and don't exist. Some of them are kind of separatist states, others are taken from fiction, others are like the South African word Azania, which is both a dream and a kind of historical possibility and a future desire. And yeah, so this list is just a list that I've been collecting for a few years and is always growing, of kind of imaginary or not. I'm not sure how to characterize them, African states, and the images are a zine of maps of these states. And I guess the thing is about this kind of the status of not being either one thing or another. They're not fictional. They are real, but they're not actual. So yeah, this is kind of an ongoing project. And the next slide is related. And I just wanted to read this. The text is an alt text that a friend of mine, Kyoto Koseki, has been working on. It's not finished. It's an alt text describing the diagram, the wall diagram on the right. And I think, I wrote something about this. Well, I guess it's somehow related to this question of representation and maybe legibility and abstraction. This diagram is a kind of passing the Marx's famous phrase, history repeats itself, first as tragedy, second as farce. And at each point, it kind of explodes the key word. So history repeats, replicates, duplicates, reiterates, reproduces, echoes, reappears, returns, rehearses, restates, recapitulates, recurs, parallels, doubles up, twins, retroflexes, reverses, copies, imitates, simulates, models, fakes, fictionalizes, couples, clones, mirrors, reverberates, resembles, reassembles, counterfeits itself, first as tragedy, disaster, calamity. Anyway, it goes on and on and on. And I guess, yeah, I don't want to say too much about this, but I was much more excited about this attempt to read the work through alt text. And alt text is a kind of provision for people who have difficulty, like sight difficulty on the internet, to be able to access information, visual information. So images have this description, and it's a very kind of formal gesture. But when applied to an artwork, I think it's kind of an open question about what kind of translation it's doing. But more importantly, I think applied to this artwork, it's an enactment of a model in my mind. And I think I'm going to stop right there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nolan. Thank you, everyone. I'm now going to invite Kojo Eshun to respond to everyone's interventions. But before, allow me to introduce him. Dr. Kojo Eshun is a filmmaker, theorist, and artist based in London and Berlin. He is lecturer in contemporary art theory at the Department of Visual Cultures, Goldsmith, University of London, and professor of visual arts at Haute École d'Art et Design, Genève. Eshun is author of More Brilliant Than the Sun, Adventures in Sonic Fiction, a second edition of which will be published by Verso in 2022, and Dan Graham, Rock My Religion, published by After All in 2012. Eshun, alongside Angelica Saga, co-founded the Autolith Group. Kojo, the screen is yours.
Thanks, Edwin. Thank you to you and to Sarah for the invitation. Thank you to everybody for their great and highly condensed and edited presentations. I feel the pressure of the edit. Normally I have more time to unpack my thoughts, assemble my notes. So these are very much in the spirit and the letter of the propositions forwarded by everybody today. Maybe we could group them into a number of frames. What I took from Nontobeko's presentation was the question of interpretive regulation, as Fred Moten puts it, the way in which the canonical structure of knowledge in South Africa, and by implication through the continent, acts to contain, isolate, insulate, and partition the generative capacities of abstraction in the specific artists that you mentioned, Nontobeko. And the forms, and the question would then be, what are the forms required to cut across the practices of containment and partition, and isolation and insulation? What is required? And the fact that you turn to fiction, the idea of Black women's fiction as a set of propositions for thinking theoretically, suggests that there's a relation between opening up the capacity of abstraction and thinking theory fictionally, that there is some kind of relation between those two, and that once those two are put into relation, then the generativity of abstraction, the ongoing generativity of abstraction, can begin to be speculatively harnessed. In relation to this, I think of the work of the Zimbabwean artist Nontsikelelo Mpiti, based in Virginia, who works with braiding, with women's braiding of hair, with weaving, but what she points out is that braiding is algorithmic. By definition, it's algorithmic. So if you take a cross-section of a braid, and in a way you simplify that braid, then the iterative capacities of braiding become open. So what you open up is a kind of speculative capacity in which you begin to imagine what happens to an African technological system when it's allowed to undergo a line of development. So that's what I take from your very compelling presentation to Nontobeko. It was a pleasure to listen to you. What I heard and enjoyed very much in Nolan's presentation was this effort to think abstraction at its most general, to think abstraction as a component in a general system of decolonization, whose implications are planetary. I link this to Julie's notion of abstraction as a project of world making. So that in both Julie and Nolan, there is an effort to think abstraction at its most wide open, to think of it at the level of what Naomi Chandler calls a general social field, just to like generalize its possibilities, such that the art making practice is an aspect of and contributes to and participates in and engenders and generates that general social field. It feeds off it and it participates in it and it contributes to it. And I take it that's part of why, or that's what is generative about Julie's presentation, in which what we see are these scenes of what Judith Butler would call the performance of assembly on a mass scale across the planet, such that that we begin to hear the sound of those photographs in their massedness and in their assembly, and that part of what Julie's presentation was pointing to is that her work speaks to that general social field. It makes that general social field apprehensible, and it confronts you with the questions of scale and questions of, in the way Fred Moten talks about the partial comprehension when you're confronted with an epic Julie Mehretu work. So I take it that that's part of what's exciting about the capacity for abstraction, that there is a sense of compressed expansion that is operative at every scale, and that it seems that in its operativity outside the body, there is a generativity which allows something like speculative capacities of technogenesis. That's to say there's a kind of genesis of the technical, which is also an ontogenesis, a generativity of ontology and a sociogenesis. And so Nolan's reference to Octavia Butler's parable of the sower, specifically to Earthsea, I think speaks to that level of genesis and generativity. In relation to Darby's point, I'd like to turn to that final moment in Darby's thesis, and of course speak to the silence of the thesis, which was loud in its silence. It was I would say it was deafening in its welcome silence. And when you thanked everybody for listening, in the sense, of course, that confrontation with ourselves was, I take it, part of what you want to gesture at when you talked about the sound of one's own thinking. Like when the thinking of abstraction, what would that sound like? So not only the sound of abstraction, not only abstraction's sonic capacity, but also the sound of the thinking of abstraction. And I take it that your theses were a kind of invitation to confront us and invite us into that. And maybe one final thought, reading around some of Julie's interviews and conversations, I came across a very suggestive notion that Julie formulated, which is that the neologism tends to bring, abstraction brings neologisms with it. That there is a capacity for neologism that abstraction has historically harnessed, and that one way to begin to think about abstraction, and one way to think about abstraction in Julie Mehretu's work is as the deployment of visual neologisms. You know, that these are, so, and this would be the confrontation with unknowing. So the confrontation with an image that we do not recognize in the way Nontobeko talked about it, an image which we do not know how to speak of as yet, an image which is yet to be filled with meaning. And an image abstraction is that which is a proleptic, an encounter with the proleptic capacity of what visuality is. It is yet to be complete, it is proleptic, it is perspective. And so this notion, I think, of the neologistic power, I think is really helpful. And so I thought of one neologism from the British music writer Ian Penman, and he has a neologism which I'm quite fond of, which is called suggesture. So it's a mixture of suggestion or suggest and gesture. So SUGGESTURE. And I read it recently and it stayed with me ever since. And I think in some way, each of the proposals are speaking to the implications of abstraction as suggesture. So I think that's kind of, those are my, without having another 30 minutes to gather my thoughts, that's kind of what I could put on the table to begin with.
Thank you so much, Kojo. Nontobeko, Nolan, Julie, Darby, does anyone want to respond to Kojo, or if you would like to respond to each other before we start taking in questions? Now is the time to do so.
I would love to just offer how appreciative I am of everybody's reflections and the specificity and the cogency of the statements. I've been thinking about these questions for a long time, and I have to admit I rarely find myself in conversations where I feel as continually energized and inspired to keep with the questions as I do right now. So I just want to thank everybody. I mean that very sincerely. To quote Nolan, I guess at the risk of sounding sincere, I'm really grateful.
I agree, Darby. And I love the neologistic power of images, what you brought up in that Kojo, and this gesture, that neologism. Who did that? Who said that again?
Ian Penman.
Ian Penman, okay.
Exactly, Ian Penman. It's in an essay of his on Dub from 2000.
Great writer.
His essay is called Garvey's Ghost, Heidegger's Geist.
Huh.
And in between is Clang. Garvey's Ghost, Clang, Heidegger's Geist. So if anybody wants the essay, I'll be happy to send it on to you, and then you can see how he's working with it. Because I actually think you'd enjoy it a lot.
Yes, I would love that.
Yeah, no problem. My pleasure.
I also thought the idea of compressed expansion is really important, and relates again to the talk yesterday, Achilles' talk, about mining possibilities and kind of this space of what can happen inside of that's a capacity for abstraction. But in that space, this compressed expansion, that there's this infinite multitudes, these kind of infinite multitudes of possibilities. So that's something else that feels very liberatory in a way as well, or potent. I also was really taken with Nolan's idea of abstraction. I'm trying to find my notes. Sorry, Nolan, because I think it's an interesting question that I have that relates to this kind of idea of this tactical approach to aesthetics and this kind of retooling of something, but thinking of that, what becomes interesting to me and part of is this constant knowledge that these kind of particular categories are never enough. Their boundaries are problematic, and so as that idea of a tactical approach, but that it's a constant morphine, kind of something that's evolving or be emergent. And I was curious if you talked about it just a little bit, but if you could talk about that a little more. I found the way you were thinking around that model really compelling.
Yeah, thank you. I also feel a little bit like Kojo. I mean, I'm super impressed, but I feel like I need 40 minutes just to kind of take it all in.
I know, Kojo, amazing.
I think there's something Nonto described in her presentation, that even as a kind of young contemporary person, you feel your confrontation. I think Kojo called them practices of containment, at least the sense that all of these terms and the kind of structure of the field is something that you're always, even at like the best of times, even when you're fully engaged and in love with whatever it is, abstraction, you're never fully a part of it. And I think that sense of having to be tactical comes out of that feeling that even, I mean, I'm definitely not the most sincere practitioner of aesthetics of abstraction, but I think even at the most sincere, even at the most engaged with the history, the art history of abstraction, there's always this necessity, even just out of, just for practical reasons, to kind of orientate yourself in a way around it. So that maybe is like the first level. And then the second level, I think, is to always be thinking about what, at least from where I kind of practice from, conceptually, is always to think like what is possible in, and also maybe what's possible, but also what's foreclosed, like what is not meant to be possible. And I think that's partly what also motivates me and some of my closest thinking friends and working friends to make some of the work that we do, which often doesn't really land very well. But I think from our perspective, goes to places that we feel we need to be. So there's something about that. And in order to do that, it also means reading the aesthetics in a particular way, being able to use them and misuse them tactically. And that's kind of, yeah, I mean, it's a lot, but it's somewhere there.
I actually feel that the Kojo's question or comment, which was so true in its description of what silence was doing for me, both consciously and unconsciously, is really that strategy, if you want, just to key into the language that we've begun to work with. That strategy for me was really spoken to in aspects of what Nolan was doing and the way that he was doing it as well, you know, and that the specific parts of the moment of that I mean are about like where you were talking about, as you are again now, putting stress on the parts where you couldn't fully articulate so-and-so. And there's a very strong ellipsis implied there. And it's in the ellipsis where we happen to be when we feel that things aren't landing. But, you know, like when things don't land, we're still someplace. The ellipsis is one word for where we are in such moments and in such times and spaces. And the sincerity for me is partly about taking those moments really seriously, not letting the requirements of narrativity steal those moments from me. You also talked about the spaces between a system, a model, and a work of art. And when you talk about those spaces, what I feel you to be doing, what I hear you to be doing is moving into the gaps in knowledge. Really like letting yourself be where knowing is not what is knowing is not what is going to happen. And further, you know, elucidating that through a process of staging the explosion of words in the givens that we inherit and that we use to orient ourselves to our reality and tell a story about that reality and our place within it. So, I mean, all I knew I was doing consciously with the silence was, you know, I thought I have a lot of ambivalence about meaning-making rituals like this one. And I have that ambivalence in a more acute form when abstraction is the subject at hand, because meaning-making is, as all of us have said in our own sensibilities and idioms, meaning-making is made complicated, difficult, at moments impossible. That's why neologism is necessary. A new word is felt to be needed. Mm-hmm. And it's actually a new logic, moreover, is felt to be needed. a new logos. We can have a word and a logic and still satisfy the terms of the past, of the root of that word. And, you know, so I really, I mean, I've grown so pessimistic about the possibilities of openness, accompanying conversations about abstraction, that I literally, until I got here today and it all started to unfold, I could not imagine finding myself in such warmly ambivalent company. And that's not a comment on any of you. It's just like, when we get together and talk about abstraction, it's like, fucking hell, like, I'm always like, where is the silence? Could we just have a little bit of not knowing? Could we just have a little less faith in our words? Could we want a little less wisdom to arise in this? Like, what? Not because there's anything wrong with wisdom and knowing and confidence, but because there's probably something else going on, or else it wouldn't be abstract. There's something else going on, you know. All of us used words like or words for possibility, multiplication, fragmentation, differentness. Wherever we cannot speak, we must be silent, at least for a moment. And it's just, I mean, this feels like church to me today. And it gives me a lot of hope. I'm not a church going person, so I don't know if this is good church or bad church. But it gives me a lot of hope. I hope that was useful.
Yes, it absolutely was. I mean, thank you. I have so many questions and thoughts, and I'm extremely appreciative of everything that everybody is bringing, and the fact that this will stay with us for a long time is actually kind of nice. I think in relation maybe to this, I'll try not to sort of ask too many questions, because we have a lot of questions from the audience already as well. But I feel like maybe, Darby, I was just thinking, once your thesis came up, like they've come up, it feels always a bit like the ghost, there's a kind of, the 15 theses, no, like from Badiou, always kind of come up in a way that kind of haunts. It comes from a position of discontent, right? Like there's like the reappropriation of it. Often I've seen it before, and it is often it is an extremely specific sort of gesture, and I think I appreciate it. And this felt very much like a John Cage meets Alain Badiou, and so it felt like a lot of nested references. And I was wondering but then there's also for me a contradiction in the sense that while like it is true that the post-structuralism has also sort of taken us only so far, and then said, well, maybe we should leave language, but then how do we leave it really? So I was wondering to what extent like you felt there was an inherent contradiction in that form, like, and I mean a tension, a productive tension, but let's say in that sense. And in one way, like sort of this for me is very much stands in contrast, let's say, to where I feel like a different kind of opening in this list where like Nolan was presenting the sort of like the chimeric states, and this sort of insistence that these are not fictitious states, and my ability to be like, yes, they are not fictitious states, I get it. And so there's this kind of sense of where, like, where do things open and where they close? But I think it is also a site-specific question. Maybe is does it already presume a certain kind of public, or does it presume a certain kind of discourse, like to which one is speaking, or from within which one is speaking?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to be explicit about that. I mean, it is for sure a presumptive genre, and yeah, it presupposes a kind of legibility and a kind of authority for a certain kind of speculation, which is specifically modernist and modern in its character. But I wanted to. I knew that really all I could do was meander my way through some thinking about the topic. I had 10 minutes. I'm in incredibly illustrious company. There are many better thoughts in the room than my own. There's some kind of real public constituted before us who I wanted to address, and I wanted to address it in as complex a way as I imagine it. My purpose in arranging the meandering I did do in that way was to just try and acknowledge and discuss some of the limits that we accept in thinking and talking about abstraction in the context of Black making and in an overwhelmingly representational world and representation driven and hungry world. I wanted to acknowledge and discuss some of the reasons why I think we accept those limitations. And I wanted to gesture towards instances, historical and contemporary, where I feel like those limits where experiments with going beyond those limits are underway. And and I knew that like several such examples of those experiments are represented on the panel itself. So I thought it'd be better for me to speak from a more sort of interested observing outsider point of view than as a practitioner, because I'm not one. I hope that doesn't sound like too namby-pamby response to your very good question.
Thank you. No, this is great. We okay. In the interest of time, Edwin, over to you.
I just had one quick comment to give in regards to a notion that Julie had advanced, world building, that Kojo then sort of retranscribed as world making. But I do think that I would be more interested in keeping with the notion of world building, because it entails a sort of process and a systematic thought that perhaps abstraction comes to disrupt in a way. So if we are to speak of meaning making, and if we are to embrace unknowability, then how can we sort of deploy abstraction in the service of world building in all of our respective views, and especially also in terms of Nontobeko, talking about letting in those that are left out, then through unknowability and through a space in which we do not sort of that is not structured around rationale, then how do we let in those who are left out, and how do we advance towards world building?
Well, if I may come in and speak to that, and as I'm listening, I am, it's really been an incredible conversation, the way that the diversity of presentation have presented us with a different way of thinking through abstraction. And what I keep hearing getting offered back to this conversation is yet, yes, there's absence. And yes, there is silence. At the same time, there's so much noise. And this thing being entangled between this position of seeing. So as we are called into this silent space, at the same time, there is this loud echo that goes along with that. And you could, I could see that in relation to Julie and Nolan's presentation. So, we brought into these quieter installations, and yet at the same time, we brought into this build-up of a lot of images that come to a space that calls us to be silent. And I guess I keep going back to a concept that I'm yet resolving, and one is about translanguaging. In the context of the university, there's so much of conversation around decolonization and how do we begin to think about ways in which indigenous language finds itself in the way that we theorize and think about knowledge making. But beyond that, I think that what has been coming out of this and speaking to me as a form of translanguaging is how do we reconcile silence, seeing, and noise in this form as a form of translanguaging and the imagination of what abstraction offers us. This is a thought. I guess I'm still thinking about it.
Yeah, and I actually, just to respond as well, that was beautifully said. Thank you so much. I just to respond a little bit to Edwin's question, I actually think that rationale, and it makes me think again of the talk yesterday, Achilles' talk about kind of how to work outside of that rationale and how to kind of how to invent a different space of those possibilities in those multitudes, and that rationale and the kind of effort to understand and find the legibility, or effort to kind of construct within that space, there is a sense of knowing in that, and it's in the unknowing and in the kind of possibility of that, of the gaps or the breaks and the possibility of what can exist in that space of kind of that invention, proto language, before actual knowing, before kind of rationale, before being able to understand that. And if rationale comes from that history of Cartesian, modern European, Eurocentric kind of colonial thought and practice, how do you invent outside of that? And that goes back to like thinking about Azulay, thinking about her writing around thank you. Thinking about her writing around this decolonizing or unlearning imperialism in terms of even thinking around art and thinking around abstraction and thinking about these as particular concrete individualized units, however you want to, like this kind of separating out of practices when they're complete, and that part that works with that rationale kind of sets that up. And I know that wasn't how you were asking it, but I think really reorienting the entire thinking in the sense of abstraction and in this sense of unknowing allows for a different form of kind of possibility that emerges from what Achilles was talking about with oralities and the constant flux of what is possible or what might be. And to me, that open experience is what I'm interested in, the time-based experience in front of a painting, the time-based experience of how it's made so differently from what I'm interested in arriving at, which is an unknowing, which is the kind of constant mining of something else. And that experience is so different for each participant with that, of the kind of communitarian collective experience of that space or piece.
I think I transposed world building to world making because I'm a big fan of Adon Getachews book, World Making After Empire. I just think that's an amazing book. So in my mind, I just transposed making and building. But also I'm not really clear where one begins and the other ends either. And then also I do think of Julie's work as one of the preeminent projects of world building and world making in our time. And I've always thought that. And despite knowing Julie for many years, I think this is actually the first panel we've ever been on.
Yes.
You know, that's totally bizarre. So the pressure of thinking of Julie's ramifying practice compressed in such a small time, effectively giving a kind of brain implosion. So that's the only reason I can explain for why I switched building and making.
Like making.
Maybe we can have both.
Yes, it's definitely to have both. It was just to go back to this visuality of rationalism and scientific diagrams that feature well either in Nolan or Julie's work, but I wanted to go back to world building because I think world making is a more sort of is a process to which we can ascribe a lot of imaginaries, but world building has tended to, I think, more recently have a very specific, process-based connotation, thus wanting to, I think, selfishly move the conversation there. But I think we now have to move to questions from the audience, if you don't mind. Our first question is from Vivian, who would love a comment from anyone on abstraction and language, given the previous lecture, Darby's intervention and Kojo's intervention on abstraction and neologisms.
There's no short answer to that one. I think it's, if someone has one, I'd love to hear it, but I have a strange conviction that a short answer to that question will miss crucial aspects of the problem that's being addressed. But for me, when I teach art history, that's the main thing that I do. I also work with art students at an MFA level, but I teach art history more than anything else. And when I teach abstraction, I teach the relationship between language and images and forms that are abstract extremely slowly and scrupulously, precisely because it is such a large question to which no single resolution can even begin to speak. So I would say, if you're interested in that question, it's about the traffic between them and knowing the difference between an abstract gesture and a linguistic gesture, and knowing how to measure their effects and their forms and their contexts at once independently and interdependently.
I mean, I think, classically abstraction has a language, a reflective language. So part of what is bringing us together is what happens when the vocabulary of blackness meets the vocabulary of abstraction. And at that point, certain a kind of, let's say, I would say, like on one level, you get interference patterns in both. On another level, I'd say you get kind of category crisis. Like the category crisis of blackness, whatever it is you have, whatever category you imagine blackness to be, stops working. And whatever type of abstraction you're thinking with, that also doesn't work in the same way. So what we're talking about is the capacity for a kind of mutually constitutive disruption that is operative with blackness and with abstraction. And of course, with so-called black art. That's part of what it is. I think that's what it is, that the capacity for that mutual disruption is what has always excited me about abstraction, that epistemological entanglements, ontological vertigo, cognitive crises, stuttering, stammering, what kind of white curator friends of mine coming to me saying, but there's no black people in the image. Where is it? Just on those, at every level, as soon as black artists engage with abstraction, all of these things happen, sometimes at the same time, usually out of sequence with each other. And I take it that part of what it is we are thinking about here is that in the time we have, is just to begin to tease out some of the promise and the threat that goes with those mutually disruptive capacities when you bring these vocabularies together and set them at play with each other in order to establish that they've always been entangled with each other from the beginning, but it's necessary to continually invent ways for confronting people with this and for confronting yourself with it. So just to finish, I think there's a kind of, it's like there's an affirmative recursiveness that happens. Like if you're an artist, it's kind of enjoyable to bring blackness and abstraction together and then sit back and watch the sparks go up. Watch the levels of multiply ramifying misunderstandings that occur. That's kind of one of the pleasures. Watch the levels of disappointment and disenchantment and demoralization that start to emerge. That's actually one of the pleasures of doing that if you're an artist. Like for institutions, it's kind of different, hopefully. It's actually different, all the levels are, but I think for actual practicing artists, it's actually kind of one of the pleasures.
I should say that it's also interesting for art historians. In 2003, I gave a lecture at a neighboring university about Black artists like using abstraction, and not in the Q&A, but after the lecture, I was approached by a colleague who also works on Black art, who is, I think, terrified of abstraction for all of the reasons that were just beautifully narrated by Kojo. And I said, why didn't you ask me, like we were friends at that time. I said, like, why didn't you ask me a question? Like, don't you have any questions? He was like, and he said to me precisely this, no, I don't have to worry about any of that. He said, I don't have to worry about any of that. It was an article, it was a lecture about an essay by Dawood Bey that had appeared on ArtNet. And I was puzzled by it because, you know, like he was using art that I really believed in as a foil against abstraction. Then, fast forward 15 years, I've published a book on this subject called 1971. That same person reviews the book and slams it because now abstraction is in Black representational space, which is a kind of, you know, shared terrain, but it's an unwelcome presence all of a sudden. And it's no longer something that he doesn't have to worry about. It's something that he actually has to go to the trouble to compose arguments against. So that shift is a really, really fascinating historical object unto itself that I think illustrates like how pervasive that relationship that you just described between its meanings for artists and for other people can be. I'm sorry, I lost hold of my discourse at the very end because I realized I'm monopolizing.
I just have a very kind of sloppy reflection, but there's something, I mean, I tend to use the word tactical, and it's partly because I got into a lot of trouble for using the word strategic. And I think when it comes to abstraction, Blackness, and what we maybe can call like the common project, the strategic implications for abstraction are really still kind of out there. In the strategic history, or like the strategic role abstraction has played aesthetically, I think there's a kind of a reading of the role of abstraction in kind of colonial image making and modern image making. But the strategic implications for a kind of common project of, let's call it, what did I call it earlier? The general system of decolonization. That thing that we share, I think it's in that realm that there's, I don't know, I've encountered a lot of trouble, and I've accepted actually that I need to step maybe 2 steps back, and I understand that those sparks that Kojo was talking about really are in the realm of like tactics, you know, they do things. And maybe this also relates to the world making, world building thing, you know, it's like when you go to the kind of higher resolution, what are the implications for these choices? And part of the attraction of abstraction, I think, is that those implications are unclear and always unclear. I'll leave it there.
I realize it's yes, I think 90 minutes for this discussion is like, it makes no sense. It should be much longer. We're already running a little bit over time, and I feel like we're holding our speakers like hostage. I'll hold you hostage for another 10 minutes before I let you go. We have one more question that I'd like to ask, and then we will wrap up exactly at 45. The question is from Angelica from the Autolith group. And she says, Moten talks about the becoming Black of the human. With this in mind, one is surrounded by seductive threats that only serve to destroy Black collectivity. With this in mind, and from the side of anti-Blackness in the UK, the question is to everyone, how do we produce an aesthetic of negative value and still survive against multiple gendered racial forms of violence that might appear as emancipation? And it's a big question to kind of tackle, but perhaps this is a beginning of thoughts toward future discussions that we will have. If anybody would like to tackle, Julie.
Sarah, would you just repeat the question actually,
yes,
please?
Moten talks about the becoming Black of the human. With this in mind, one is surrounded by seductive threats that only serve to destroy Black collectivity. With this in mind, and from the side of anti-Blackness in the UK, and I would add elsewhere, including France, the question is to everyone, how do we produce an aesthetic of negative value? So the question is, how do we produce an aesthetic of negative value and still survive against multiple gendered, racial forms of violence that might appear as emancipation?
Kojo, you want to go first?
There's several questions there. Maybe the aspect I think I can speak to is the question of negative value, which is drawing on the thinking of Denise Ferrer's builder. I think abstraction potentially already has a capacity, if not for negation, at least for reconnaissance. Not so much unknowing, but not knowing. I was thinking a lot about, because these days you read a lot about unknowing through Azule, but I was thinking about not knowing, reconnaissance. I think abstraction has that capacity to knock away the props and the supports. You realize how much Blackness operates as a support and a prop and reserve and an infrastructure for how much Blackness is valueless and absolutely valuable, like all the time, everywhere. But let's just take specific art worlds now, and then I'll just take the art world I know best, which is effectively the UK art world. That's where you can see this paradox, which is not really a paradox, of non-value and absolute value, and the way in which these two things converge to support and prop up an entire structure of value. And I think abstraction is already doing that work. The question is in a way, the amplification of that. The amplification supports and scaling up of the work of abstraction that's actually already been going on. That is, when you look for it, you see it. It's there, you hear it. It needs to be affirmed, So I'd say it's the methods of affirming. Whether, as Nolan said, it's a question of shifting scales from the short term of tactics to the shifting away from tactics to strategy, or which one is long term and which one is short term. Sometimes I get them confused. Tactics is meant to be short term and strategy is meant to be long term, right? Is that the distinction people work with? So sometimes it's a question of shifting the scale at which you work on magnifying the work of abstraction to draw out a kind of, to draw out the amplitude of it, in a way to think with Tina Camps, to think with the visual frequency of images, to draw out the kind of frequential aspect of abstraction. It's a question of working on methods. In other words, I think there are, to cut it short, I think there are all kinds of Black artists already working on abstraction. And it's that work that in a way you need to build a kind of discursive sound system around that work in order to create an amplitude for it. For me, that's part of what Nontobeko's presentation was about, building a theoretical sound system to amplify the work that's already happening. So it's not about discovering not about discovering work. It's not about bringing new work to the market. No, it's about building an apparatus for amplifying what is already there so that it starts to do its work, you know. And in a way, collectivization is one way of doing that. And insofar as collectives are under threat, it's because they indicate an understanding and a practice that is doing that work of affirmation. In a weird way, a threat is an inverted compliment paid by those people who recognize the efficacy of the practice.
I'd like to say something about method too, because on the other side from artists, Black artists doing abstraction and sounding out and hearing those frequencies, there are observers, responding, picking up on those frequencies and having responses. And the more we can do to produce a context in which those responses can multiply and resonate and echo and dissonate, and generate eventually a language that we won't feel so reluctant or bashful or overly sincere about. That's just another language for art and what happens when Black artists do it, like whether it's abstract or not. So I think all those practitioners who are already on that frequency need to be accompanied in history by responders who can speak their responses into a discursive and experiential critical mass. Once we have that, we won't need panels like this anymore. You know, but there's never any panels about representation and Blackness. It's like, it's a fucking given. It's a given. We don't need panels about that. It's like we need panels about obviousness. Like, why is that such a given? How has that remained an unchallenged given for so long? We can have a panel about Blackness and obviousness, but we need panels about Blackness and abstraction because it still doesn't have the space it needs to live a life that is truthful to what it means to offer, to the kind of experience that it affords, et cetera, in my opinion.
I think on that note, and perhaps the next panel will be on obviousness. I think that is a good place for us to start. I want to thank everyone, like a really warm thank you. This has been a very, very generous discussion. It is extremely important for the context in which this is taking place, which is difficult perhaps to embody as we're all in our homes doing this. I hope you will join us later. And I will let Edwin introduce the next segment before we sign off.
Thank you, everyone, for this extremely generous interventions and insights. I'm very happy that this will be archived and accessible to all in the upcoming weeks and months. I will now be introducing Crystal Mess, apologies, whose live stream will begin at 8 p.m. through the Quai Branly Museum's YouTube channel. Crystal Mess is a French-born Ivorian Guadeloupean producer, DJ, writer, and artist based in Paris. Her teaming production immediately stands out, yet oscillates freely between melodic techno, Afro-trance, and abrasive dancehall. Her stunning debut EP, Mere Noises, has graced the CDJs of Bill Cooligas, Code 9, and Bonaventure, among others. Crystal Mess's approach to production, DJing, and performance bridges radical energy and phantasmic Afrofuturism. Her polyrhythmic and eclectic DJ style gives an uncompromising, globalized, and diasporic definition to techno and club music in general, and has seduced the world's finest clubs, including The School, Berghain, Corsica Studios, Concrete, sharing key slots with Helena Hauf or Lotic, and created sound designs for fashion houses such as Kenzo or Paco Rabanne. please tune in at 8 p.m. for Crystal Mess's DJ set, which is hosted in collaboration with Rinse France.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.